When God destroyed the world with the flood, it was for the great wickedness and violence that had filled the earth, and it is therefore presented as a just death penalty. Genesis 6, 11-13. Therefore, it does not seem like an accident at all that it is right after the flood that we have the first explicit statement of the human duty of protecting human life and punishing those who take it unjustly. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. Genesis 9, verse 6. The institution of capital punishment is therefore a societal, cultural commitment to self-defense and the protection of human life. Introduction. The most basic principle that lies at the foundation of just war and righteous self-defense is the image of God and the prohibition against the illicit destruction of that image. While there is a sense in which we may speak of the sanctity of human life, it is more proper to speak of the sanctity of God and His Word and His image that is to be held in high esteem. Therefore, with God's permission, human life may be taken for the protection of human life and the righteous retribution for life that has already been unjustly taken. Failure to defend human life may therefore itself be a failure to honor the holiness of God, the holiness of His Word, and the holiness of His image. Our duty to God includes pursuing this justice. The death penalty. While God intimates the first death penalty in the garden threatened for Adam's disobedience, the initial theological lesson is one of grace. Genesis 2:17 and 3:21. Instead of being put to death, Adam is covered with skins and sent out of the garden. Likewise, God spares Cain for his fratricide, but the blood of Abel cries out from the ground for justice. Genesis 4, verse 10. When God destroyed the world with the flood, it was for the great wickedness and violence that had filled the earth, and it is therefore presented as a just death penalty. Genesis 6, 11-13. Therefore, it does not seem like an accident at all that it is right after the flood that we have the first explicit statement of the human duty of protecting human life and punishing those who take it unjustly. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. Genesis 9, verse 6. The institution of capital punishment is therefore a societal, cultural commitment to self-defense and the protection of human life, and therefore the wholesale abandonment of capital punishment is likewise a cultural abandonment of self-defense and the protection of human life. Arguably, the same principle is the ethical foundation of the right and the duty to personally defend our lives and families, as well as for communities and nations to defend themselves with lethal force if necessary. Castle law and proportionality. Quote, if a thief be found breaking up and be smitten that he die, there shall no blood be shed for him. If the sun be risen upon him, there shall be blood shed for him. For he should make full restitution. If he have nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the theft be certainly found in his hand, alive, whether it be ox or ass or sheep, he shall restore double. Exodus 22, verses 2-4. Here, God establishes several additional principles related to self-defense in particular and just war in general. In the case of a break-in, there is an ordinary presumption of guilt on the part of the trespasser and innocence on the part of the homeowner. There's no blood guilt if the homeowner defends himself and the trespasser is killed. However, the law adds that if the sun is risen, the home defender may be held liable for bloodshed of a thief, since justice demands restitution for theft, not a death penalty. Now, the principle is one of knowledge of intention. This is what is meant by the sun be risen. If the guy is loading a box of your power tools into the back of his truck, you may not shoot him dead. The sun is risen. You can see what he's doing. However, if it is unclear what his intentions are, the sun is not risen, and a homeowner may reasonably fear for his safety and or the safety of his family, then there is no blood guilt if the trespasser is killed or harmed. This principle is applied in Western law codes under the name castle doctrine and can apply to wherever people have a right to privacy and security and may reasonably fear for their safety. The Fourth Amendment in our Constitution is witness to this principle. The other principle at work in this text in Exodus is that of proportionality and restitution based on the principle called the lex talionis. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. That's in Exodus 21, 24, and 25. Lex talionis literally means law of reciprocity. What was intended to be done to you is done to the perpetrator. Since he intended to deprive you of your table saw, he must return your table saw and be deprived of the same item or its equal value. This is the base level double restitution. What he intended to do to you is done to him. This principle is therefore one of proportionality. If some guy steals your table saw, you may not justly hunt him down and shoot him. If he knocks out your tooth, you may not take off his head. This is symbolized in images of Lady Justice as a woman either who is blinded or has a blindfold, and she's holding scales in one of her hands. The principle of proportionality is the idea of bringing balance where crimes have created imbalance. The duty of home defense. The duty of protecting human life is enshrined in the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. The death penalty is mandatory for murder and a possible maximum penalty for other crimes, including adultery, man-stealing, sodomy, rape, and high-handed abuse of the elderly. We see this in Malachi 2:16, Mark 7:10, Deuteronomy 24, verse 7, and Romans 1:32. Therefore, while not always required, we should understand those crimes as often approaching the same harm as murder, and therefore may sometimes be justly defended against or punished with lethal force. However, even during the days of Moses, God was phasing out familial criminal punishment. For example, the avenger of blood principle. And instead, he was establishing civil magistrates and the duty of judges to bear the sword. We see this in particular in Deuteronomy 21, verse 19, where in the infamous passage of the rebellious son, it must be the father and the mother, notice that, mom and dad, two witnesses, who may bring the rebellious son to the judges of the city, who then, having heard the complaint and the accusations, may decide to execute the death penalty. Notice that a family may not carry out the death penalty, only magistrates. Deuteronomy 21, verse 19. Related is the duty of a man to love his wife as himself and his own body. Ephesians 5, 28 and 29. That would include self-defense and the defense of your wife and family. Likewise, raising up children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord includes providing for them and keeping them safe. Ephesians 6, 4. That nurture and admonition includes home defense and the safety of your children. A man who does not provide for and therefore protect his own household is worse than an unbeliever, it says in 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. By extension, under certain circumstances, our duty to love our neighbors may also include our common defense of our neighbors and our nation in just war. Just war theory. The criteria are often divided into two categories in just war theory: jus ad bellum, the right to go to war, and jus in bello, right conduct in war. While Aristotle considered this topic, it was Augustine who was widely recognized as the first to give it serious thought, particularly from a biblical and Christian point of view, focusing primarily on the necessity of just cause and the need for authorized magistrates to declare war. While individuals are the magistrates of their own home and familial safety, God has authorized civil magistrates to bear the sword of his wrath. Romans 13, verse 4, 1 Peter 2, 13 and 14. Thomas Aquinas came later, adding a third principle of personal intention to promote good and avoid evil. Other criteria have often included the war should be a last resort, the force, violence, and cost ought to be commensurate to the threat or the evil committed. This is another application of the principle of proportionality. The violence should avoid non-combatants, and some have added the necessity of some measure of hope for success. Finally, during the Reformation, the doctrine of the lesser magistrate was also developed, arguing that lower magistrates had not only a right, but also a duty to interpose in order to defend the populace from tyrannical and abusive higher powers. A couple of common objections. What about Jesus' teaching about turning the other cheek? Christ's teaching must be held together with all of Scripture. Jesus also teaches that we must hate our families to be his disciple. Luke 14, verse 26. I'm not aware of many Christians who take that woodenly and literally. They understand it in its context. Likewise, when the soldiers asked John what they must do, they were not prohibited from continuing their military duties. Luke 3, verse 14. Putting these passages and others together, it has widely been concluded that Jesus is talking about our personal dispositions towards our enemies. We are not allowed to hate them. We're not allowed to harbor bitterness against our enemies, and we must honestly want their good. Wise, prudent action also includes taking into account when we are in positions of weakness, which means we ought to be willing to suffer, which does not necessarily always prohibit self-defense or just punishment by authorized magistrates or just war. Parents may not take personal offense at their children either, but this doesn't prohibit judicious corporal punishment of their children. Likewise, Romans 12 prohibits Christians from taking vengeance into their own hands and requires personal charity. Your enemy is hungry, give him something to eat. Thirsty, give him something to drink. And then, in Romans 13, immediately after those verses, it explains that magistrates are God's ministers of wrath and vengeance. So, call the cops. Likewise, Hebrews 11 describes those who, by faith, subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, waxed valiant in fight, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, were stoned and slain with the sword. By faith, different circumstances call for different acts of obedience. What about the wholesale destruction of cities in Canaan? The Bible teaches that God commanded the entire destruction of cities in Canaan for their hard-hearted wickedness and evil. Genesis 15, verse 16. However, the Old Testament teaches that God does not destroy the righteous with the wicked. Genesis 18, 23, and 32. And even in the land of Canaan and the Battle of Jericho, Rahab and her family escaped the destruction of Jericho. On the other hand, Achan, an Israelite, was utterly destroyed for acting like a Canaanite. Joshua 6 and 7. This indicates that the utter destruction of certain cities in Canaan was on entirely moral and ethical grounds, and therefore it was not ethnic genocide at all, but it was a supernatural, just punishment. Joshua says that none of the nations that were utterly destroyed were interested in peace, but their hearts were hardened like Pharaoh's, so that their destruction was thoroughly just. Joshua 11, verse 20. And even in the conquest itself, God made a distinction between the cities of utter destruction and ordinary, just war principles. Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 18.